I thought that I would take this time to talk a little bit about poetry for me, why I find it to be the genre that I come back to, what some of the key factors are that go into how I write the way I write as I see it, and then realizing that for me that my experience will be very different from yours, likely. I'll stop talking after a while and open it up to questions, and we can kind of construct the conversation amongst ourselves. I want to start out by talking about place in poetry. One thing that really, I started writing before I left my home territory, which was kind of the Mississippi River Valley in central Minnesota. But when I moved out to the west, to Nevada, the experience of living amidst geological time, visible geological time, changed my writing a lot. Other things were happening at the same time in terms of my learning more about experimental poetics too, so I don't want to discount those factors. But living in a place, as you do, where you can see, when you just look up at the ridge line, you can see a striation, a rock formation that indicates time scales that are almost unfathomable, that are almost so large that you can't really process them. They outdate your species, and they're just very small features of your landscape that outdate your species. That changed my sense of what poetry could do. It made me want to incorporate scale in my writing, and I think that I had been brought up into a poetics that was very straightforwardly narrative and meditative, and I wrote poems, about my life. I wrote poems about my job. I wrote poems about my family. And I constructed them as short stories with line breaks, And when I started to have this kind of opening experience of understanding that poetry could do more than just tell stories in a different format, I started to incorporate material from histories that weren't my own. I started to incorporate material from science. I started to have a different perspective on the significance of events, because living with a sense of geological time can be it's not only artistically healthy for me, I think it's also personally healthy for me, It can be easier to take a deep breath about some things that might otherwise seem extremely stressful, but when you reflect on the geology that surrounds you, it can help you relax. In Nevada, I had an opportunity, and I'm not sure what similar kinds of opportunities are available to you around here, but in Nevada, I had an opportunity to see some really interesting land-based art that was very helpful to me in my development. In particular, a couple of things. Ancient petroglyphs that date back to some of the first humans in this region who had settled along the shores of what was Lake Lahontan. The two principal remnants of Lake Lahontan are the Great Salt Lake and Pyramid Lake in northern Nevada. Now there's about, 500 miles that separate those two remnants, maybe more. The lake was huge. It covered most of all of northern Nevada and most all of Utah. So it was a very large body of water that has evaporated into these two small remnants now. And along the ancient shorelines of that lake, which are marked by these benchmarks, these gravel benchmarks that you can see with the naked eye now, as the water receded and settled at certain points, as you look at the landscape, if you're looking directly at it, you see them as stripes. I mean, you know, like literal stripes, or if you see them at a little bit of an angle, you see them as steps. And along those different steps, you will find petroglyphs from civilizations. And those are various, and there are various interpretations of them. And those interpretations are interesting to me, but they're not super crucial to what I'm talking about. Mainly what was crucial to me was just seeing the remains of seeing what was left of a people from so long ago. They didn't have many artifacts. You know, they were subsistence people. They spent their days trying to feed themselves, and so these carvings are pretty much all that's left of them. But then there were a couple of there was an object that was discovered in an ancient cave along ancient Lake Winnemucca, which was another remnant of Lake Lahontan. A piece of antler maybe about this long, maybe 5 inches long, and yay wide, and it's perforated like about 100 times, 92 times or something like that in this small piece of antler. And the piece of antler was kind of carved down and flattened. And it's a very signature artifact from this time period, because there just are not many examples, or maybe any other examples, of material from those people that is not directly functional. And nobody really understands what this piece is. It's just known as perforated object. And nobody really understands what the purpose of the object was. That's fascinating to me. Along those same shorelines, there are remnants of villages built just after the Intercontinental Railroad was closed, which was, 1849? Your history 101s are much more recent than mine. 1849, I think, the Golden Spike. A lot of the laborers who worked on the Intercontinental Railroad, the Transcontinental Railroad, were Chinese immigrants. And when the railroad was finished, many of them found themselves out of work in the middle of Nevada or places like that. And along the shorelines of Lake Winnemucca, which was still at that time about 60 feet deep, it's gone now, but it was still a viable fishery and a viable lake at that time. There are the remains of these fishing villages, Chinese fishing villages, and all that there are left of them are just, ankle-high stone foundations and some remnants of the houses that have kind of crumbled around them. That's all that's left of those, civilizations such as they were. I think they were there for a fairly short period of time, but it's pretty startling to notice that actually the petroglyphs from 15,000 years ago are much better preserved than the houses from 100 years ago. The houses from 150 years ago are pretty much gone, just blinked into geology, and what you see of them almost just looks like a tufa formation or a small volcanic, remnant. And in another 100 years or so, I can only imagine that they'll be completely invisible in the landscape, and that's so interesting again. And these ideas are not really about. You might not think of these ideas as poetry ideas, but to me, living in a place where these kinds of experiences were available, to just drive out of town, pull off to the side of the highway, and with somebody who knows what they're talking about can show you some petroglyph sites. It just really opened up my sense of the sense of scale and time in my art. There's an artist named Michael Heizer who has a piece on exhibit at LACMA right now, who is a Nevada-based artist who works with big giant rocks, really, and digs. He makes big holes and cuts channels in the landscape. And his work has been interesting for me to see too, because he's interested in creating negative spaces on a really large scale. The The piece that he has at LACMA now is basically, I think, kind of a suspended boulder over a channel. And that's interesting, use of material. Just find a cool rock that weighs about 60 tons and move it. And by moving it, by placing it elsewhere, make it art, make it an object that you perceive. I find that interesting. He has, this is the thing of his that has particularly captured my imagination. Since the 70s, he has been working on a site in a valley just about 150 miles north of Las Vegas on a massive work called Complex City, or just City. I've seen it referred to as just City. And it's basically a kind of like a Mesoamerican plaza. Like you might imagine, like a ball court, like a Mayan ball court kind of plaza. If any of that kind of archaeology is familiar to you, his dad was an archaeologist and studied Mesoamerican structures and communities, and so a lot of this thing that he's building is based on those findings. And it's about something like a mile and a half long, and more than a quarter mile wide, kind of a long rectangular piece, and it takes up, actually not that big a portion of this valley, but it's situated in this large valley. And that work, that construction of, that literal construction of negative space has been interesting to me in terms of poetry, because poetry has the potential to have negative space in a different way. Every line break, every page that a poem happens on, every page that a written text happens on, starts as a blank page, and from a certain viewpoint, it's an open space that you could just as well draw a picture on it. You could just as well put one word in the middle of it. You could do whatever you want on that page as an artist, due to a history of generic conventions that have been, handed down to us. When we write poems, we tend to start on the left and then write over a little ways and then hit return. And that tends to be what we do, but it doesn't have to be what we do. The space of the page is potential. So I find an analogy of that in Michael Heizer's work that I think is pretty interesting. Overall, in terms of scale, I guess the thing, this is kind of the end of the first thing that I want to talk about. The idea that I come back to in thinking about scale in poetics is just that humans, we don't know, we don't know exactly what we are involved in. There's a pretty big distance outside of us, and there's a pretty big distance inside of us. Like the further down, the further in you go to the molecule or the atom, the more you find. There's no bottom to that hole yet. There are particles that people think are the core particles, the lepton and the quark, but that's just a theory. That's just because the big tube that we have to crash things together in can crash them together hard enough to make those little particles. But if it could crash them together a little harder, maybe it would make smaller particles. And the universe, whatever, what is that? Is that apparently it continues to grow. I like this, it's expanding, right? It continues to grow. This is an idea that you can say, but I can't imagine, okay? That the universe is expanding, and what that means is that it's expanding into nothing. Nothing is there, and then it makes more of itself as it goes forward. And it's very difficult to imagine that without imagining a black space around something that's moving forward into that black space. But that's not actually the case. There's no black space around it, because if there were black space around it, that would be something. Like that would only be part of the universe. So the thing that's happening is a thing that you can say. It's expanding, it's moving outward, but it's a thing that you almost can't visualize. Or I can't really visualize. It puzzles me. I can't get it. I try sometimes. I have too much free time. sit and think, try. So we don't really know what we're involved in. We're kind of in the middle. I feel like we're medium-sized, or maybe we're small. We're small, maybe. But there's infinite regress beyond us, and there's infinite regress below us, in scale, smaller in scale. And I find poetry to be a genre of writing that is, just for me, nimble enough to, in an artistic way, play on a larger scale than, or a smaller scale than our ordinary, human communications. That's the end of my landscape part. Do you have any questions about that? Do you want to talk about that, or should I go on and we can come back? Yeah.
I understand about the idea of writing on a scale that's bigger than yourself. When you were talking about the universe expanding. But what do you mean by smaller? How can poetry encapsulate a world smaller than our own human communication?
Well, you can think about the chemistry of things, for one example. The poetry of chemistry is smaller than, I guess maybe you would say it's not smaller than us. It is us, it's in us. But it's smaller than what we usually talk about. Poetry can go there. A poem can go from a conversation between two people or a moment of narration of an experience. A poem can step out of that into a chemical equation or a chemical analysis, if it wants to, as part of the poem. And that can be in the poem. A poem can inquire into the spaces of subatomic particle interactions, even as it is, romantically musing from the top of a mountain. In fact, the top of a mountain is an excellent place to think about very small things. And maybe that's what that man is thinking about in that famous romantic painting where he's standing at the top of the mountains in his nice blue and white ruffly suit, staring out into the sublime of nature. Maybe he's thinking about chemistry. I don't know if that answers that question very well. I feel like it would be better to try to show an example of that or something. But I don't want to do that just yet. I guess that's maybe the best I can do right now. Poetry can look at the constituent parts. Poetry can look to the insect life that surrounds us, and that we interact with, and can move from a important interpersonal moment that might seem to be the narrative engine that's driving a piece to the box elder bugs that are accumulating on the windows outside your apartment. And it can make that step very nimbly, very quickly, in ways that more narratively occupied genres, I feel like, don't have that freedom, and that freedom is part of experience, part of perception, I want it to be. I want it to be part of my perception. I don't want to feel like I am locked in by narrative consciousness, which was kind of the next thing I was going to talk about. I'll try to be more brief about this, but people will tell you that we are naturally storytelling creatures, and they will mean by that not just that we communicate through telling stories about our lives. We talk to each other in terms of stories. What are you doing? Is something that you would say to, you probably asked that question multiple times per week. What you doing? And what that is an invitation to narrative, you know? Like, it's a very simple move that we have in our culture. We tell each other what we're doing. We tell each other stories about our lives. And it's not, people will tell you that it's not only that, it's not only a means of communication for us, but it's actually so deeply internalized, that story is so deeply internalized in us that it is our way of perceiving the world. Our perceptions are channeled and actually created, selected maybe, by our sense of our own life as a story. We see our lives moving forward as narratives. We are our own protagonists, usually. Sometimes we are not. Sometimes we even recognize when we are not our own protagonists. But often we are our own protagonists, and we are moving through plots that have themes. We are completing events and looking back and reflecting on the significance of those events. Even as we move forward in larger trajectories that we think of in terms of our larger goals and our life story. I think all of that is true. I feel like it's true that we do that, but I think that it's a historical mode and not a piece of, not a facet of nature. I don't think that it's a part of our hardwiring. And the reason that I don't think that is that I have this really hangs on one example for me. So it's a precarious thread. Maybe it's natural, I don't know. Maybe somebody could show me evidence that we are hardwired for narrative. But have you ever heard of the anthropologist Bruce Chatwin? He has a book about Aboriginal Australian cultures called The Songlines. And he studies this nomadic Aboriginal culture that travels through Australia, and their mode of communication and thinking and kind of their way of being is this tribal community action called Dreamtime Songs. They sing these things that are called Dreamtime Songs, and as they move through the land, they believe that their song is creating the land that they are moving into. And they have a pretty, you know, like a repetitive cycle of places that they move during their year. And they sing these songs as they travel through those places. Now that's a very different mode of consciousness than narrative consciousness. And I feel that if that mode of consciousness is possible, then it means that narrative consciousness is not a natural thing. And I don't know why I make such a big deal out of that, but it's kind of a big deal to me, because stories have shortcomings. We are not always protagonists. Things do not always proceed in a cause and effect way. If we do the right thing, we are not always rewarded, etc. Like, etc. The logic of stories does not always fully apply in life. And another reason why poetry continues to be, I think, the genre that I am just most compelled to explore is because it's the genre that most easily breaks out of narrative. I think for some writers, I think there are short story writers, even though that's kind of ironic. I think there are short story writers who can break out of narrative pretty easily. For me, it's just poetry. Like, every line break in a poem, to me, is an opportunity to shoot off in a direction that's unexpected. And it's just a much more nimble genre for me, and I want that in the art that I make. I want the ability to get out of pre-structured thought if I can. To the extent that I can get out of pre-structured thought, I want to try to do that. Because I think that's where interesting art will be. And then last thing, I think, poetry is an art that is made out of language. I think of poetry as for me, poetry is an art form, not a mode of communication. Poetry can communicate, but I don't think that that's its primary purpose. I think its primary purpose is to be a work of art. And poetry has this weird relationship to meaning, because poetry is the art that is made out of the thing that we exchange for meaning. If you think about painting, we do not paint each other a conversation. Like when I talk to you, I don't paint it to you. I say it to you in words. So when I make art out of words, there is meaning present in the exchange. There's meaning there inevitably, because the thing that I'm using to make my art is also the thing that I use to make meaning. That's clear, right? I just keep saying that over and over again, but you get it. So that means to me that meaning is part of the artistic palette of poetry. Poetry can manipulate the plane of meaning. Like we talk a lot about the image plane of a poem, what you see when you read a poem, or you might talk about the narrative arc of a poem. Well, the arc of meaning in a poem, you can manipulate that. It's there, it's part of what a poem is made of, and you can defy it, you can choose to submit to it, you can tweak it, you can turn it, I guess that's something that for me comes out of, I think my interest in that comes out of linguistic studies, and just the idea of that's kind of the theoretical founder of linguistics is Ferdinand Saussure, this French theorist, and he kind of fully theorized the idea that a signifier, a word, has an arbitrary relationship to the signified thing. Podium, just, a simple example. Podium, this thing called a podium, could be called something else, an egg. The word egg could be the word for this. It's just a series of historical circumstances that have led us to call this a podium. And that when you think about that, for me, I guess, as I first encountered that idea 12, 15 years ago. But as I live with it more and more, it starts to have an impact on me more and more. Things like life and death, those are words. They're words. I mean, in the process for me of writing Absentia, which I think maybe you've read some of, that book took shape in a difficult time for me. I was writing poems, but the manuscript kind of started to happen at a time, the first time in my life where I had a group of people die in a short period of time. Within a couple of months, and one was my friend's baby, and one was a student, and so they weren't all like grandmas and grandpas who were ready to go. It was a tough period of time, and there were a lot of facets of dealing with that, and most of which had nothing to do with poetry. But as poetry kept happening out after that, it started to be more associated with these incidents, with these grievings, I guess. And death is this word that we have for this thing that our bodies do. And life is a word that we have for this thing that our bodies do. And I guess it gets profound for me at certain points to realize that our method of exchanging feelings and thoughts about what happens to us in our lives, that method is language, and it's not adequate. It's not adequate. It's not always adequate, anyway. And so it's ironic in a way to make an art that is made out of that material. But what better material to gesture beyond the limitations of language than language? It's not that all my poems are always all over the place, breaking all these rules of physics and narrative and etc. But I like the ability of a poem I come back to the word nimble, to just be able to gracefully extend outward and away and come back if I wanted to, or keep going away if I wanted to. And poetry feels very responsive to me in that way, and that's why I continue to come back to it.